What do we know about the Antichrist? There are a lot of people who are teaching things about this person might be the Antichrist, that person might be the Antichrist. These people are not the Antichrist. Here are the details that we know about the Antichrist. Let's start the discussion with this. First of all, any conversation about the Antichrist that tries to solidify technical details is already suspect. Why am I saying that? I'm saying this because the scripture is incredibly careful to the details that it does and does not mention. A lot of times the details of what the Antichrist is going to look like are more functionality as opposed to specific names, identity, nationality, culture, etc. So for this video, instead of looking for identifying characteristics or more specifically timeline things to look for to make sure that we can understand, oh, is this the time? Is that the time? Are we waiting for something else? I want to get into something much more pattern-focused, warnings that are given, especially by Jesus and the apostles, the language surrounding the Antichrist, so that way we can understand a bit of what this person, looks like in a different way, talking about function again. Categories for discernment, so that way when you go and you look at the Bible and the text yourself, you can come to your own conclusions. I'm really wanting to limit the conclusions that we come to and just look at the details that are given so that you then can go and make your own decision. The biggest danger is not that we won't see the Antichrist, because everyone's going to see him. The danger is that we will see him and not recognize him. Let's start with some foundational texts. I think of Daniel 7:8, where it talks about the horns, and a little horn comes out from the midst of these horns. And so this is one of those texts that are oftentimes quoted as the little horn is going to be the Antichrist. We see 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. This is the man of lawlessness. This is the one who opposes and exalts himself so that he takes his seat in the temple of God. Very much going back to this idea of the abomination that causes desolation that we saw Daniel talk about. Jesus references it. And again, Paul seems to be citing a similar type of language that when you go back and you look at those passages, it talks about the temple being in the sanctuary being trampled and somewhat taken over, depending on the context of how you want to take certain details in the Gospels. So something important to notice about this, before we run too far away, is that this is somebody who sets themselves up in the temple. They are not outside of religion. They're inside of it, or at least in some sort of a way to acknowledge the significance of the temple and to desire to seat themselves in the temple as defiance of God. We see the Antichrist language explicitly being used in 1 John, I want to say chapter 2:19. And it talks about how these people who are Antichrist went out from them. That would suggest that they are in the midst of the apostles and the disciples, but they're not part of them, meaning they're not in the same heart and the same spirit. They're Antichrist. They are not only opposed to Christ, they are that which Christ claims to be, but in a distorted, opposite end of the spectrum sort of way. Whereas instead of mediating outward, everything's mediated inward towards themselves. And of course, the biggest text that everybody is going to understand and know is Revelation chapter 13. This is the beast that comes out from the waters, comes out from the sea. Some people say these are nations and peoples, at least within the context of the rest of the book of Revelation. Others suggest this is just an indistinguishable mass of possibilities. Some people say this is chaos that he's coming out of. But it says that this beast was given a mouth that had very haughty and blasphemous words, and there was authority that was actually given to this beast with this mouth. We also see the mark of the beast, the 666, that this beast is one that causes everyone to take up the mark, and especially if they want to be within commerce. In order to do this, they have to take up the mark on their right hand and their forehead, not and, or their forehead. And so again, we see there's a mark, and then distinctly there's a number associated, which is the number 666. That's Revelation 13:8. So to give a really brief summary of this, we're looking for someone who is going to arise unexpectedly. We're looking for someone who operates in religious space, or at least religious space proximity. Someone who most likely arises from within and demands allegiance. someone who mimics authority. And when you come to those characteristics, the question becomes, well, who in the Bible do we see that forms those religious or those specific characteristics? So specifically what we're asking is, when Scripture gives patterns and guardrails and details, where did those specifically point toward? This is not a matter of the Antichrist has to be Jewish, it has to be Islamic, it has to be Christian, it has to be, in some sort of a religious proximity to the Jewish temple. This is here are the patterns that we see. How do those then lead us to believe or lead us to suspect later? We do have examples that are outside of Israel who are great examples of what the Antichrist would look like, I'm thinking specifically of Goliath, that when you look at the measurements given to this person, the details that are associated with him, you have 6, 6, and 6 all associated right there. This would put the mark of the number of the beast at least associated with Goliath, who is not a Jewish person whatsoever. I personally find that when we go all the way back to the very beginning, we see Cain as the first Antichrist symbol. What are the details? He brings an offering. He speaks with God. He stands at the altar. We were in 1 John 2 earlier, 1 John 3:12. John talks about Cain, and he says that he was of the evil one. The danger of Cain was not that he was outside of religion or that he was ignorant. It's that he was misaligned. Another example that comes to the top of mind is in Numbers 16, Korah. Korah suggests that all of the congregation is holy, thus minimizing the mediator that God had chosen, Moses. Who is this guy to be leading us? The whole congregation is holy. Why are we listening to this one guy? Well, when you have the Antichrist, it's the exact same thing. Jesus talks about there will be many who come and they say, hey, I'm the guy. And Jesus is like, don't listen to them. Why? Because there are people who are going to actually believe that they are the Messiah. And there are going to be people who actually believe that Jesus is not the Messiah, but that they are the Messiah. Part of the pattern that's being shown here is that they reject the mediation that God has provided and are giving an alternative mediation. There's only one mediator between you and God, and it is Christ. Any other supposed access that we have to God is false. It's Antichrist. Look at King Saul, anointed by God through the prophet Samuel. He was the chosen king. He was chosen by the people, but God blessed it. And what happens? He takes obedience and he turns it into control. He takes calling and turns it into self-preservation. The one who was anointed suddenly ends up being a guy who is demon-possessed, consulting a witch. The guy who was given to lead Israel is suddenly the one who is now persecuting and oppressing and hunting the one who is now anointed David. King Solomon, he builds the temple. He is excelling in wisdom, far above almost any other human in the world, if not every other human in the world before and after him. And yet, what do we see? We see that his annual income is 666 talents of gold. Again, 666. We don't see him necessarily associated directly with an Antichrist type of pattern, nor do we necessarily say it's the beast. But we do see the trajectory, that it was underneath Solomon's rule and through his oppression and his slavery that the next generation split the kingdom with Rehoboam. It was not Rehoboam who split the kingdom, it was Solomon. Rehoboam doubled down. I mentioned this one, Goliath, before, and how when you look at the measurements of him and his sword and the things he's carrying, they describe him with 666. So he is another one who is clearly at least hinting toward a pattern of this person, that the book of Revelation, the author John, he's the one who would notice the pattern and reference it as the mark of the beast intentionally for us to be able to go back and see, okay. Now, notice the contrast here when we switch to Goliath. This one's an easy one to recognize. Cain is not easy. King Saul is not easy. King Solomon, 50-50. Finally, the last one that I want to give as an example is the Apostle Judas. Judas was chosen, trusted, intimate, very close to Christ. And yet he was the one who deceived, who brought in the ability for the crucifixion. He's the one where it said that Satan entered him. He's the one that John says was the son of perdition. The exact same phrase used later for the Antichrist figure. And so we can see that the most dangerous enemies of Israel are typically not the ones outside, like the Babylonian or the Assyrian, who are also considerably Antichrist pattern. But most often, the most dangerous enemies of Israel are the ones who come from within. They are the ones who are misaligned participants within the story that God is continuing to show. When you think of some of the terminology associated, Antichrist, it's not just against Christ or opposed to Christ. That's obvious. But instead it's in place of Christ. This is a counterfeit Christ. He performs counterfeit miracles. He performs counterfeit gospel messages. The lawless one, the terminology comes from an Old Testament foundation of what lawless means. Typically, lawlessness is not an issue of the pagans outside. Lawlessness is an issue of the people who are inside. So this is not pagan chaos. This is covenant distortion. And I think this is why the detail can be given that he sits himself in the temple. How does he have access? We can say, oh, it's brute force. He takes it like Antiochus Epiphanes, or we can say that he takes it like Rome, but those patterns don't necessarily fit the specificity of the details that Jesus and Paul are trying to cite here, and they don't seem to answer the details of Revelation chapter 11. And I think the most striking term is the son of perdition. We see it twice, 2 times. First, Judas. Second, the lawless one, whom Paul's talking about. Those are the only 2. The question becomes, if the first usage was of Judas, who was within the covenant and walked next to Jesus, is the last one going to be the same pattern or not? Now, when we talk about the mark of the beast in Revelation 13, there are 2 things that it mentions. The right hand and the forehead. Deuteronomy says we're to make ourselves these tassels or these straps, that we're going to bind them upon your hand and between your eyes. So once again, Antichrist at this point is not just opposed to Christ. It's taking that which Christ has ordained and saying, oh, we're going to actually shift that over here. It's going to be an anti-pattern. It's going to be a counterfeit. The number 666, it said it is the number of a man. We can, and it has been assumed that we can assume that the number 6 is typically associated as the number of man. And then the number of 7 is typically seen as the number of completion. So when we say 666, this is an uttermost humanity exalted as divine. That's a pretty common interpretation of the mark and the number. As far as the number of the beast, I only see a couple times in the Old Testament where the pattern seems to erupt naturally, which is Goliath and Solomon. In both of those cases, the number itself doesn't seem to have a specific context of what exactly that means or implies. So I think scripturally we need to allow there to be tension and not make that a concrete observance and say, it has to be this. We're drifting into numerology in order to try to solve that puzzle. But when we back up and we don't try to solidify details, we can say, okay, well, the number seems to be telling us what the beast is, whereas the mark tells you who belongs to him. If we focus on the son of perdition idea, and Judas is the template here, we see that Judas is not just a villain. He's not just a bad guy. He walked with Jesus. He was chosen. He was near. He was trusted. He was aligned, and then shifts and misaligns himself, breaks away. When I say aligned, I mean he was in union with Christ. He was a believer. He was a disciple, and then decided at some point, I need to push events into history to taking place like they should, and then decided to sell out the Messiah to the Sanhedrin. When Judas deceives him with a kiss, he's not pointing from distance. He's not saying, okay, well, the guy over there who looks like this with the red sash instead of the green one. No. He doesn't point from afar. He actually misidentifies him. Actually he sees, but it's not, he doesn't perceive. That type of misidentification through intimacy. And we can glean from this that this final deception of the Antichrist, I don't think it's going to be simply a rejection of Jesus. I think it's going to be a misrepresentation of him. He's not going to look like Jesus, even though he's going to sound and look like Jesus, if that makes sense. Now, here's something else to consider. When we look at corporate election, We'll specifically say Old Testament, not get into the theology of it all. The Old Testament election is Israel, right? So that's the chosen people. There's corporate election, but individuals can still sin. Individuals can still fall. Individuals can still be opposition. Just because you're inside that which is corporately elect doesn't mean that you are now somehow vindicated automatically. This is the problem with Cain, is that he thought he was angry. I did the thing. I'm in the family. I did the thing. Why am I not looked at with favor? Korah was within the priesthood. Why am I having to listen to this guy Moses? Right? You see what I'm saying? Saul, he was the king. He was the chosen king. And yet when he hears about another, his predecessor, instead of rejoicing and saying, there's someone after me, I can train him, I can equip him, I can show him what it looks like to have to be king, so that when he gets here, he's not just taken by surprise. No, what does Saul do? He persecutes. Judas, he's one of the disciples, and yet he misidentifies who Jesus actually is. He says the Messiah is supposed to be like this over here. This guy, I think he's the Messiah. Well, I'm waiting for this stuff over here that's not happening. He misidentifies because he didn't understand. And I think this is why it says in Acts 20, verse 30, that from among your own will arise men, not outside, but from within your own fold. And we see the pattern that external enemies persecute, internal enemies deceive. So when we're looking at the current events today and we see that there's Islamic hatred against Israel, and we say, or we see Donald Trump trying to associate himself in a bizarre way, and we go, or we see Benjamin Netanyahu, and we're like, whatever it is, I'm not validating, I'm not invalidating, I am simply acknowledging that these are multiple ideas out there. There are also more than just those ideas. People are looking at Putin or Russia in general. Some people think even further into European territory, like Germany was a great example, or if you go north to Scandinavia. There are people who are across the board and across the spectrum here, and everybody's looking for the obvious enemy of Israel, the imminent king of the north, the one who's from way up yonder. To me, it's too obvious, too expected. When you see the descriptions and the warnings that are given from the apostles and from Jesus specifically, you see this is someone who is going to be able to deceive us. This is not somebody that we're going to see and go, aha. We're not going to have an aha moment. This is someone who is going to be able to deceive the elect, if that's even possible, as Jesus said. When we see Daniel, it's a little horn. He's unexpected. He's subtle. He grows quietly. And the next thing you know, this guy's everywhere. The beast in Revelation, we saw he rises from the sea. Whether you see that as chaos, whether you see that as the nations plural, whether you see that as a big mass of people that you can't identify, the whole point is still the same. I referenced Matthew 24:24, where Jesus says that this is someone who is going to rise up, he's going to deceive many, he's going to perform counterfeit miracles, and that even the elect, if it's really possible, that even the elect will be deceived. Even they're going to be led astray. Paul talks about a great falling away. It could be the exact same type of thing he's talking about. These things require shared language, whether Christianese or just an understanding of the Bible, whether it requires plausibility, that this person has to plausibly be the Messiah because he can deceive the elect. Whether we're talking about the Jews as the elect, or we're talking about what more modern theology would try to debate as what is the elect. I don't really care how you look at who the elect are. Either way, Jesus' words mean that it would be plausible that this person would be supported. So in here, the deception is not because they're easy to expect, like an Islamic Antichrist, or like a far kingdom of the north Antichrist, or the president of the United States, whether it's Ronald Reagan or George Bush or Obama or Donald Trump. It doesn't matter which president you're pointing to. They all seem to get the same label at some point in time. But when I look at Jesus' words, I see someone who is not an expected enemy, but rather someone who you're not prepared to question. And this is the biggest point. Jesus never says to predict better. He says to discern. The rebuke that Jesus gives in Matthew 16 when he says you cannot discern the times, he's speaking to people who were informed. They knew prophecy. They knew that this is the timeline that they should be expecting the Messiah to show up. You can do the math from Daniel. It doesn't matter what decree you calculate from. It all ends up somewhere around that first century period of time. But even though they knew the scriptures, and even though they knew the signs, even though they knew the prophecies, they still missed the fulfillment in that time because they did not discern the times. They didn't know how to. And this means that the knowledge that you have of prophecy does not guarantee that you're going to recognize its fulfillment. And that's why ultimately I've been saying I don't want to come to any specific conclusions, even though you can clearly see that I lean further into whether Christian or Jewish. I would say someone who is appropriately aligned with the covenant, meaning that in one way or another, we would all have to identify them as a possible candidate. I'm trying not to come to too in-depth of conclusions, because when I see Jesus talk about it, he never says you're going to see him and you're going to identify him. He says to discern. So no matter what your study of prophecy does, it should never look to answer and identify who the Antichrist is going to be. What is the mark of the beast going to be? What is the number of the beast? Those are details you can search out. But the overall point is to align yourself with the correct kingdom so that you have the ability to discern. I'm not trying to claim certainty. I'm not trying to claim identity or timeline. What I am saying is that when you follow the patterns of Scripture through, it seems to me what's most likely is that a Jewish Antichrist is most plausible, coherent, textually grounded. I'm willing to bend and say all the way out to a Christian Antichrist. I think that that's less plausible given the context of it's going to be a Jewish temple that he would have to seat himself in. And how does he gain access to that if he's not Jewish? But this again is not a concrete, thus saith the Lord. This is from what I see, here's my conclusion. But I think overall, the biggest point would be discernment means we are willing to call things into question. So for my introspection, my biggest question to myself is, who am I least prepared to question their authority? Not because I should question everyone's authority, but if you're going to make a claim, I need to be willing to back off and say, okay, let's test the claim exactly as they're claiming. Scripture never gives us the call to solve all of the mysteries that are in the Bible. Instead, it calls us to remain faithful all the way to the end and to trust even in the times that are testing our loyalty. Who's the Antichrist going to be? I ultimately don't know, and neither does anybody else. We can have certainty in some details. We can have certainty in some explicit details. When you read the book of Daniel, it gives you a lot of things that you can identify. There are a lot of markers. The problem is none of those markers are specific enough to give you an exact here's what to expect. So whether you agree with me, whether you disagree with me, ultimately the biggest issue that I want to promote is learning discernment and aligning yourself with the kingdom and the character of Jesus. The only way that we're going to be able to discern the times at all, and the only way we're going to be able to discern the different figures that are calling themselves leadership within the covenant, is if we ourselves are covenantally aligned and we know what it looks like to follow Christ, and we know how Christ follows the Father. If you're interested, I actually have a booklet on Discerning the Times. The link's in description.